The first slide is about what is Musevenomics. What is Musevenomics? For those of you who are very familiar with the presentation, I apologize for boring you. But for those who have never seen this, we want to take some serious time and understand and appreciate this. I think I'm getting in the way. So, Musevenomics was coined together by economists at Operation Wealth Creation in 2020. It came as a result of the National Planning Authority presenting the Third National Development Plan, NDP3, to His Excellency the President, and time was running out for them to, for the President to sign before NDP3 came into force in July 2020. However, the President took his time. He was busy with a number of state issues. So they ran to General Saleh and requested him to help them remind the President. So the General Saleh and his office wrote a long document summarizing what was in the NDP3 and then sent the letter. They received that letter and responded in 2 paragraphs. But the main thrust of the paragraph 1 was that, thank you for the letter. I have seen the NDP3, but I have not read it. But the most important bit here is that, but I know what Uganda needs. So the general was disturbed by that response. So he asked his entire team, what does the President know that we don't know? So he tasked them to go and study what the President knows about economics. By the way, Musevenomics is about economics of the President. President Museveni is a husband. So some people know him as, somebody knows him as her husband. He's a father. Some people know him as their father. He's a military man, a general. Some people know him as a fighter, as a military person. But he's a politician. So many people know him as a politician. And that aspect of him is well pronounced. Every time you mention his name, people think about him as the politician. But he's also an economic philosopher. And Musevenomics is presenting the economics philosophy part of him. So, when OWC was tasked, the economists at OWC were tasked to find out what he knows about economics. They reviewed all his speeches. I was part of the team. So we reviewed all his speeches and his letters to find out what exactly he knows. Of course, we put those letters together and the speeches and published a book called Musevenomics. But as we were studying, we handed over that book to him in September of 2020. Then he said, as you study about me and what I know about economics, and for you to be on the same page with me, I want you to go back into the history and answer 6 questions. That what was the economy of Uganda like before the colonialists came, i.e. 1900? Then what was the economy of Uganda during the colonial period up to 1962? That is the second question. We all know that between 62 and 71, we were finding our way. But when President Amin took over in 1971, things started going south, especially in 1972 when he expelled the Ugandan Asians, 80,000 of them, who controlled 90% of our economy, 90% of entrepreneurship. So we were isolated. So then he asked, what was the magnitude of collapse between 1971 and 1986. Then number 5 question is, what was the economy of Uganda like in 1986 when NRM took over? That is number 4. Number 5 is, what is the economy of Uganda today? And the last question was, what will the economy of Uganda be when we are fully developed? So out of that, we studied and continued to learn more about him, and the word Musevenomics was born. And it comes from 2 words. One is Museveni, the philosopher I have talked about, the economic philosopher. And the second word is nomics, which comes from a Greek word, nomos. And nomos means a number of things, but for our purpose, it is about management as it's applied in economics. So when you put the 2 words together, you get Musevenomics, which stands for the economic policies and the philosophy deployed by government of Uganda under the leadership of President Museveni that transformed our economy from a failed state in 1986 to one of Africa's most transformed and stable economies today. It's a long statement, but it's the economic policies and the philosophy used by His Excellency's government, the NRM government, that have transformed our economy from a failed state in 1986 to a stable economy today. And that sums up what we have done since 86. Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Uganda have been at the forefront of this philosophy called Musevenomics. I will share the presentations with you so you can, during your free time. Am I hiding? It has refused. So the second question that people have been asking, are you praising Museveni? Are you praising Museveni? Is there anywhere in the world where a leader has been, an economic philosophy has been named after a leader? But before we even talk about leaders, some of you who are familiar with economics, you have heard about Keynesian theories. This was after a man called Keynes. But in terms of leadership, again, we have presidents. But let me mention a few. In the United States, they had a president called Ronald Reagan. He took over from Jimmy Carter. During Jimmy Carter's time, the American economy was going south. Unemployment, people were becoming poorer, and companies were collapsing. So when Ronald Reagan came, he came with a number of policies, including deregulation, giving more power to the private sector, giving more space to free markets to operate. And the American economy recovered and has never been the same again. So the American economists referred to Ronald Reagan's economic policies as Reaganomics. In Japan, they were going through a recession for 2 decades until they elected Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and Abe transformed the Japanese economy. So the economics of Abe was referred to as Abenomics. Actually, this week, President Trump was in Japan, and he admired the economic policies. He said, I was one of the biggest admirers of Prime Minister Abe. Unfortunately, he was assassinated recently. In UK, for those of you who are familiar with the UK politics and leadership, they had Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who also came during very difficult times. She came with a number of policies, including privatization of state companies. And today, economists in the UK are studying Thatcherite policies. So for us in Africa and in Uganda, we are studying Museveni and his policies. Why? Because there is no blueprint for development anywhere in the country, in the world. What developed America could not develop China. What developed China cannot develop India. And whatever is happening in India cannot be applied for Uganda. But Africans, we have been copying and pasting policies because of the way we have been educated. So we go and study about these theories, we bring them to Uganda, and we try to implement them. So as a result, sometimes the results are not so good. But in Uganda, we have developed our own methodology, which has worked for us as a country, and other countries can borrow from it. Musevenomics works for countries that have been previously colonized, that they have gone through a prolonged conflict and have collapsed. So some of those countries like Rwanda, Burundi have borrowed from us and have applied our philosophy and are being successful. Others are still going through what we went through, like Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, Somalia. They have an opportunity to pick a leaf from Uganda and transform their economies faster than we did. But away from these big other countries, back home, Musevenomics can be applied by leaders at all levels, at national level, district level, sub-county level, parish level, village level, but also even in our homes. We can apply the principles and the pillars of Musevenomics as a husband, as a head of a family, and run the economics of your home successfully. So we are teaching this concept to all leaders. And today, when we have you, the leaders, who are leading PDM across the country, we thought we should present this, especially the pillars, and you can appreciate them and see how we can apply them in PDM implementation across our respective local governments. So, I'm learning. So, Musevenomics, what is unique about Musevenomics? Musevenomics picks from the different schools of thought. Like I told you, we don't copy and paste. We pick from Western capitalism. So when you look at our history since 1986, we have promoted privatization. We have promoted free market economics. We have the central bank just involved in regulation, but the banks are setting their own prices. We moved away from price controls where we used to determine the prices of goods and services, where we used to set the price for Uganda shilling in the forex market, and BOU just sat back and said, you determine, the market should determine the prices for every good and service, but we will regulate. So we pick a number of elements from Western capitalism, but we also, given the president his background, that when he was in the bush fighting and his early days, he was trained by socialists and Marxists. He read a lot of books like Karl Marx's books. He was mentored by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who had a socialist thinking. And all his young life, he used to criticize, our president used to criticize the capitalists. But of course, when he became president, reality kicked in and he changed his perspective. So we pick a lot from the Asian development models. For example, the long-term planning. When we set Vision 2040, a 30-year vision, we set it in 2010. That is part of what the Asian guys are doing. Government playing in strategic sectors like infrastructure. That's what the Asians do. So, but beyond the Asian models, we also had our own models as Africans, African communalism. And we promote African communalism in our policies. So the introduction of, for example, PDM is a Ugandan born initiative which is built on our way of doing things as Africans, from Bulungi Bwansi, community activities that we run, the community welfare, that was mainly African. In Uganda, when you want to get married, how rich or poor you are, when you find a beautiful lady and say, I have found a good thing, and announce, your friends will contribute. You just give them a budget, they will contribute. In the UK, you can't do that. In the capitalist economies, when you find a wife, you just inform them. Actually, you send them an invitation card. They will not contribute anything. They just come for the wedding. Your wedding is your happiness. It has nothing to do with us. But for us, it is very important for everybody. So, Bulungi Bwansi, when I was in Chisoro, I saw people were doing their own roads every Saturday. And anybody who missed was fined 20,000 shillings. In capitalist world, that is the role of government. So we are not bothered, we pay taxes, let the government go on about it. So as Uganda, we have our own way of doing things, which we have preserved. And as such, part of our economic policies put this into consideration. So to develop Musevenomics as a concept, the policies of our government, we pick the best from each of these different models. At some stage, there are certain things that were forced on us because of the circumstances, as I will explain. But overall, we pick the best from those different models and develop our own unique policies that work for our contexts. So these slides explain Musevenomics thinking and how we pick from other schools of thought. They give you more details on the different methodologies, but I will not go through these in detail. So they're about what the Asians do, the infrastructure investment, human capital development, industrial policy, African communalism, like collective welfare, which I've talked about. When you lose a relative, we all contribute. There is a book where we cite. In Ghana, they even throw a very big party for about 2 weeks. Everybody contributes, everybody dances. They will celebrate somebody's life. But that is part of our African communalism. We work together. But we pick from these to come up with our own model. But is Musevenomics, did it start in 1986 as a philosophy? So the philosophy did not actually start in 1986. But the policies started in 1986, but the philosophy started earlier. In the 60s, our president was born in a peasant cattle-keeping family. And most of his people were involved in pastoralism, moving from one place to another. So in the 60s, government came up with ranching schemes, and they were kicking people off their land. So President and his friends, especially Mwesigwa Black and others, mobilized the people in his home area to resist anybody kicking them off their land. But as they were doing that, they also educated these people to abandon subsistence farming, what we are calling chit kolera chida chonka today. For them, they started at a very young age in the 60s, when he was about 22. So mobilized the people in his home area to stop working for the stomach alone, to work for the market. You would have 300 cows, but you cannot afford to buy salt in your house. You have no shoes, but you have so many cows. So he said, no, you need to work for the stomach, so produce for the market. And that's where now what we are studying today of transformation of subsistence households into the money economy, as a philosophy, started at a very young age. And throughout his life, he has been pushing that no Ugandan, nobody should be left behind. You should not develop while others are poor. But in the 80s, at the peak of the struggle, around 1984, under his chairmanship, the NRA presented what they call the 10-point program. The 10-point program was their manifesto, the first manifesto that they developed, that they would use to promote their struggle, but also when they took over in 1986, they implemented, until, of course, later on, we went into electoral democracy. But the 10-point program was their first manifesto. Within that manifesto, the 10 points, we had a number of points that specifically spoke to economics or the economy. And one of them is point number 5, which was building an independent, integrated, self-sustaining economy. We are still pursuing that dream. As even under Vision 2040, we are pursuing a dream of a sustained, an independent, integrated, self-sustaining economy. As we will learn later from Dr. Ngabo's presentation on parish action planning, we want every parish to have the same vision. An independent, integrated, self-sustaining parish can be a dream. But this started in the 80s, among the 10 points. Within the 10 points, of course, he was fighting corruption as one of the points. Up to today, we have that as a key principle. He was talking about African integration, that he did not see the integration of East Africa as just a small market, but as a foundation for the unification of Africa. So the welfare of our neighbors, African brothers and sisters, was very important, but it was included within the 10-point program. Later on, when we, as we learn later today, that later on we came up with the East African Community, re-established the East African Community in 1989. So all these were part of the origin of Musevenomics. But of course, later on, when we started going into electoral democracy, he developed other manifestos. And the current one, which is promoting under the theme of protecting the gains, has a number of economic targets for the next 5 years. So these ones you will read, for those of you, especially the young ones who don't know or who have never heard of the 10-point program, you will go back. But within the 10 points, there are points that are currently were not economics in nature, but they were foundational for any economy to grow. For example, security. It was not economics, but it's a foundation for security. Democracy. It was not economics, but it was important as a foundation. National unity, for all of us working together as one country. Even up to today, whenever he's talking, says, I don't want the politics of identity, of interest. Yeah? So you cannot say the Baganda, the Bacholi, whatever. He preaches Ugandanism. So all of that came from, this is part of the origin, but some people claim that we abandoned the 10 points, which is not true. It was the first manifesto, but in successive manifestos, as you will learn, we have developed policies, we have evolved as our economy has grown. We have been evolving over time. In terms of course, this one I've talked about it, that in his early days, he was influenced by Marxist revolutionary thinking in the 70s, and then, of course, the way African countries were fighting colonialism. But later on, he adopted capitalism. He mobilized a lot of money, which we used to invest in infrastructure, in security, in human capital development, and then kick-started the growth that we have been looking for. You will look at the quotes. These questions, I went through them that are in my preamble, that we had to answer 6 questions. And all of you need to spend some time and study our history. Because I have heard people saying, in 19 Uganda was better than Korea. Yeah? But if you look at Korea's history and our history, in 1962, what happened 10 years later? 10 years later, we kicked the Asians out of Uganda. We were isolated by everybody. We had a president who conquered the British Empire, and therefore nobody wanted to work with us. We started killing each other for a very long time, until 2006, when we defeated Kony and his group. So that context is extremely important to explain to our people that history. So the 6 questions, you need to spend some time and understand what we used to be. Before the colonialists came, but before they came, we had a booming economy. Kingdoms like Uganda, Unyoro, Toro had established tax systems. They would collect taxes and finance their activities. They had their own way of communicating. You can imagine how the Kabaka Mwanga ordered the killing of Bishop Huntington. You can imagine how were they communicating, Busoga and Mengo, when there was no phones. So we had our own systems. Yeah? So, in terms of livelihood, we were about 99% subsistence, and mainly focusing on our subsistence agriculture. But we were doing we had blacksmiths, we had people in our own textile industry, we had people involved in hunting, and we would be selling animal skins, hides, ivory, and we had established trade links with the Swahili coast in Mombasa and Zanzibar. And as such, our economy, if it had not been disrupted, we could actually have been very far, especially in terms of innovation and industrialization. But we are disrupted. Somebody came, they showed us their gun, so we adopted our advancement in converting our spears and arrows. By now we could have our own, but we also had African technology. I was told when the Chibuka Mumbale would go to Bunyoro to fight, he had his own African technology, fighting in the clouds. I don't know how true that is, but things changed when the colonialists entered. And in between 1900 and 1962, all our economy was driven based on the British interests. Our agriculture focused mainly on producing materials that were needed for the British. But they also ensured we had the food, because if you have no food, you can riot and become a very big problem. So we had the cash crops and the food crops. But beyond that, we were not doing much. So economy relied heavily on those ones. And of course, the extraction of some of our minerals, infrastructure that was developed was for extracting the raw materials for the British industries. But of course, we kept evolving. In the 50s, coffee had a lot of problems, so they introduced a number of other crops until we were given our independence in the 60s. As you can see, there were attempts to increase African ownerships in the early 60s up to 71, until Idi Amin came and things started changing. Bote II came and it tried to rebuild the economy. But of course, there was civil conflict. Some people blame Museveni that if he had not gone to the bush, maybe Obote would have done better. But before Museveni went to the bush, there were other rebel groups that were fighting. So even if Museveni if he hadn't joined, other people were already there and destabilizing the country. But from the 60, from that time, we came to 1986, where we need to know. Now that's when the policies of Musevenomics started. Previously, we were talking about the philosophies, but the real policies now started when he took over power. In 1986, it is important to know what the economy looked like. We were growing at about 1.5%. Men lived about 41 years. President Museveni was about 42. So when he took over, and he said the reason they called him Musei was because he was above the average life expectancy. It was 42, the life expectancy. For men was 41. And there are many things that used to kill us, the men. Women lived longer. Their life expectancy was 49. So today, men are at 68, women at 71. So today, if you died in your 50s or 60s, you would be a young man. In the 80s, if you died in your 50s, you would be a Musei, and they would say he has eaten enough. But many things used to kill us. The war, diseases, HIV came. Our kids could not survive because of the 6 killer diseases. Then, of course, 400,000 Ugandans lived outside the country as refugees. Today, we have inverted that. We are hosting refugees. But in that time, 400,000 of us, especially the educated, the people who would build the country's economy, the teachers, the doctors, the engineers, they were outside the country. 1.2 million of us were internally displaced. So most of these places we are impassable. If those of you who use Gulu Road, Matuga, beyond Matuga upwards, it was a danger zone. Anybody seen there, you would be shot at without any question. So things were very difficult. So most of our people, many of us, were studying, because at least I was alive that time, I was young. But you would study. As you are studying here, there is a war, you leave, you go to another part of the country. 1.2 million of us were in that league. Manufacturing was performing at 5% capacity. Industries were performing at 5% capacity. A lot of the government industries were making losses. Government of Uganda was committing 15% of its national budget to finance those companies which were making losses. 15% of our national budget was going to support those countries. Their technology was obsolete. It's the technology of the 60s. The human capital had fled the country to manage those factories. So that was the story of 1986.